What's up, guys? All right, today we are talking about the Monroe Doctrine and the election of 1824. This is your third lecture of Unit 4. Make sure you have your journal open and you're taking notes. It really does help you remember this stuff. All right, so we're in the Monroe presidency. The year is 1823, and Monroe's going to give a whopper of a speech. It's his annual address to Congress. It's the December of 1823. 1824 is an election year. So this is kind of like Monroe's last big speech. And the sad thing was, Monroe, this great American, this last of the Virginia dynasty, this last of the founding father generation to be president, isn't really getting much due in Congress. Everybody loves and respects Monroe, but because he said he wasn't going to be running for a third term, all these other people under him are jockeying for position, and nobody's really paying him much mind. Monroe constantly has to be raising his voice as he's giving this speech before Congress, but in a section of it, he delivers what has become famously known as America's foreign policy stance for the rest of the 1800s and much of the 1900s, the Monroe Doctrine. So let's kind of dive into it. All right, I wanted to have these maps up for you guys. So at this time in 1823, remember what is happening in the larger world scene. In 1822, America is going to recognize the new Latin American nations that had just gained their independence from Spain in the Latin American revolutions. So we recognize, 1821, that was the Mexican Revolution where Mexico broke away from Spain. In 1822, next year, we recognize Mexico as an independent nation. Same thing with Chile right here, with Argentina, with Colombia, Venezuela. They've all broken away from Spain. And remember, at this time, Spain really only has Cuba and Puerto Rico left in the Americas. That's its last bastions of colonial power. But there are other European powers at this time who are starting to make advances because back in Europe, the Napoleonic Wars have just concluded. Remember, the War of 1812 actually ended in 1815, and that was kind of also simultaneously when Napoleon was having his last gasp and, chance at glory with Waterloo and his 100 Days and everything else. And so now that the Napoleonic Wars are over, Europe can kind of start to refocus on the big picture. Namely, remember that idea of mercantilism, that they need colonies in order to have a strong empire because colonies work towards the mother country providing raw materials and support and basic power. So with that in mind, now Europe's looking back to the Americas all hungry-eyed and saying, where can we colonize next? Spain can now focus on maybe trying to retake those places that it just lost, like Mexico and Chile and Argentina and Colombia and Venezuela. You also have Russia under Tsar Alexander I at this time making advances over here on the west coast of the Americas. Russia is going to make inroads into Alaska, of course, but they're going to go all the way down and start to claim some of the British Canadian lands. They even go so far down and start establishing Russian forts in Northern California, which is going to kind of make President Monroe and his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, a little bit nervous. So we have Spanish threat, we have Russian threat. France has a few colonies over here. You can see French holdings in blue. Here in the Caribbean and South America. And so basically what this is going to mean is that America is really going to try to find a way to keep Europe out. Remember, we just had the War of 1812, Britain coming back. We don't want Europe to re-exert itself in the Americas. And at the same time, our interests kind of align themselves with our old mother country / enemy, Britain. Because Britain also does not want the continental European powers like France and Spain and Prussia and these other guys to take a hold. There's a holy alliance happening between those continental powers, and Britain doesn't like it. And also keep in mind, this is about financial interests. This is about economics and trade. This is about that idea, again, of mercantilism, that colonies exist for the good of the mother country. If you think about it, these colonies that have just become independent and now are their own nations recognized by President Monroe in the United States as independent, such as Chile and Argentina, Colombia, Venezuela, Mexico, they formally had been required to send all their trade goods over to Spain, right? Their mother country under mercantilism. But now, because they're independent, they could trade with us. We could have, a lucrative alliance and markets to sell our goods to. And it could be a really good business venture now that these nations are free. So for our economy, for money stuff, this is a good thing that these nations stay free. And that's where Britain has the same idea as well. Remember, Britannia rules the seas. Britain has the greatest navy in the planet. They're going to have no problem doing lots of trade with these new independent nations that they would not have been able to trade with previously because they were under Spanish rule, and Spain was not allowing any trade with its babies, with its colonies. And so knowing this, the British minister to America is going to make a offer to America and say, how about we issue a joint declaration saying that the Americas are off limits? Now, Monroe's Secretary of State, whoops, there he goes, this handsome guy, John Quincy Adams, he's going to say, President Monroe, maybe we should not do that. There are several reasons, right? Namely, Britain has been kind of ugly to us in the past. We just fought the, Revolutionary War Part 2 in the War of 1812. We're still kind of hurt over that. And it kind of also diminishes America's power if we have to hide behind the coattails of Britain. We look like the flea on the back of a dog, angrily shouting, yeah, that's right, you better leave us alone or we're going to get you. Well, the dog is like the one that's scary, right? We don't want to be the flea on the back of a dog. And so John Quincy Adams is going to take a run at a rough draft and everything. But really, this is President Monroe's thing. Okay, he is an expansionist. He is a great mind. Give him some due. The last of the founding fathers. He's going to take John Quincy's advice and he's going to put together the speech that he delivers here before Congress. And he's going to basically say, the Americas are off limits to European colonization. Period. Boom. That's it. No more colonization for you, Europe. Okay. We do this without Britain. We do it just on our own. More on that later. We also say that America likewise will not interfere in the affairs of Europe. So basically, you mind your business. Okay, here's the map. Europe, we're going to stay out of your affairs. You have some wars, you're fighting. That's cool. We're going to stay out of that. You stay out of this area here, the area circled in purple. That's our domain. That's the Western Hemisphere, right? The world is divided by the prime meridian, 0 degrees longitude. That's right there. This is the Western Hemisphere where the Americas are, North and South America, Central America, and the Caribbean. That's the Americas. That's ours, our playground. Stay out. And that's basically what he says. Now, a couple things. It is laughable to think that, here you go. It is laughable to think that America could actually control the Western Hemisphere at this time because, again, do we have a navy? Not really. Britain has the navy. But in this sense, our interests align themselves with the British interests. We don't have to be actually enforcing what Monroe is saying because the British Navy will inadvertently enforce this for us because that's their interest as well, to keep these new Latin American nations free. So it kind of works out. And was Britain mad at us for issuing this doctrine by ourselves? I mean, they weren't pleased, but there wasn't much they were going to do about it. It's not like they were going to go to war again for the third time, against us over this. It kind of works out in their interests. So it works out very well. And it is a huge statement of American foreign policy. Remember, foreign policy is when you're dealing with other nations. This is going to lay down kind of how America is going to be operating, like I said, for the rest of the 1800s, going well into the 1900s. It plays a big role in our manifest destiny as our nation, you can see right here, is going to be ever expanding westward during the 1800s. It's going to also play a big part when we get to 1898 and the Spanish-American War, when America beats Spain over its last holdings there in the Caribbean, like in Cuba and Puerto Rico. And then it'll play a really big role and be kind of vamped up under Teddy Roosevelt. In the early 1900s, Teddy Roosevelt, the Rough Rider of the Spanish-American War, is going to issue his corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, kind of adding to it and saying that America will be the policing power of the New World. Even so far as into the 1930s, President Franklin Roosevelt of the Great Depression and World War II, he is going to issue his good neighbor policy in reaction to all this. And so the Monroe Doctrine, it's laying forward that America is in charge of the Western Hemisphere, that this is our domain, that Europe stay out. And it also issues forth an idea that will play another important role in American life moving forward: isolationism. Isolationism is the belief that America needs to mind its own business and stay on its side of the Atlantic. And that'll be a big debate when we get to the time period before and after World War I, and of course going into World War II later on in the 1900s. So that is the Monroe Doctrine. And one last thing, remember its place in history. Remember what Monroe is drawing from. I talked about where this is going to go. Remember where it comes from. It also comes from George Washington's farewell address, when George Washington said that we need to stay out of foreign entanglements. He means we need to stay out of wars in Europe. We can't be, as a young nation, dragged into those conflicts, or they will take us down. And so Monroe is kind of reaffirming that idea that Washington had set forth in his farewell address. All right, guys. So 1824 is an election year. James Monroe has already said that he's stepping down. He's old at this time, the last of the founding father generation of presidents. It's time for a new generation of Americans to become our leaders. And that is what we're going to see in the election of 1824, the next generation of American leaders. All of them are present: Andrew Jackson, Daniel Webster, William H. Crawford, John Quincy Adams, and Henry Clay. Now, let's go over a few of these candidates and who they were. And remember, there is no oppositional political party yet at this time in 1824. The reason we call Monroe's presidency the era of good feelings was because there was only the Democratic Republicans, only one party, ever since the Federalists shot themselves in the foot at the Hartford Convention at the end of the War of 1812. They done. So they're all Democratic Republicans, but like I've said, there are sectional differences growing throughout the nation. Okay. Remember, at this time, I don't want to spoil things too much, but let's just do it anyway. At this time, okay, the Western states out here, they have their own interest, okay? They have interest in expansion, in getting more territory. The northern states, they have their own interests, maybe in abolition because they don't want the cheap slave labor or many-minute slaves, but also in manufacturing mainly, in industry, in financing, banking. That's the interest of the North. And for those interests, they support things like a national bank and a tariff. The West, in order to get out West, you need things like public improvements to infrastructure, roads, you need railroads, you need canals. Railroads aren't yet quite a thing at this time, but canals and roads, that's what the West wants. A tariff and internal improvements for infrastructure, that stuff, and a national bank, that's stuff that the North wants. And the South, they want to again protect their agricultural economy that is based around cash crops such as cotton. They don't want a tariff. So the South is that other region. So even though everybody's a Democratic Republican, they're starting to split along these regional differences: the West, the North, and the South. And that's where we kind of see these candidates emerge from, because each will be chosen as a nominee by their regional area. So John Quincy Adams, the son of President John Adams and Abigail Adams, we talked a lot about how he is this very important Secretary of State under President Monroe. You remember he helped to draft that Monroe Doctrine and everything, and helped to get us Florida and all the northern boundary with British Canada and all that. He is the sectional candidate representing the North, especially New England. Literally, there's a town in Massachusetts called Quincy, is where he was born. So John Quincy Adams, Massachusetts boy, he is the New England, the northern candidate. Then you have Henry Clay, the great compromiser, the guy that brought you the Missouri Compromise and helped keep the nation together when it looked like it was going to fall apart in 1820. Henry Clay represents the West. He's from Kentucky. He is the Kentucky boy. He has interest, remember, in his American plan, or the American system, which involved, internal improvements like infrastructure, roads and canals, and eventually railroads. It involved a national bank, and it involved tariffs to protect American nascent industry. That's his American system. And especially those internal improvements because he's from the West. So he is the Western candidate nominated by his home state of Kentucky. And then from the South, the Southern regional candidate, you have William H. Crawford. And that should actually be William H. Crawford. And I'm just going to like check that real quick because I need to fix that otherwise. Yeah, that was William H. Crawford. I don't know why I had that on there. Anyway, but it's fixed now. William H. Crawford served under Monroe's administration as well as John Quincy Adams did. Crawford served as the Secretary of the Treasury, and he actually had been doing some things to undercut Monroe during his last few years as he positioned himself to be the natural Southern Virginian candidate to replace President Monroe. Because remember, Monroe was coming off of a long dynasty of like Southern presidents. You'd had, of course, George Washington, but then in a row, you had Thomas Jefferson from Virginia. You had his Secretary of State, the next president, James Madison, also from Virginia. And then you had his Secretary of State, also from Virginia, James Monroe. And so William H. Crawford from Georgia is also from the South. He wants to be the natural legacy to that Virginia dynasty, the Southern dynasty. And he was positioning himself to be that candidate. And so he represents Southern interest. That's agrarian, kind of the opposite of the American system interests. So he's very against like Clay's American plan. And so that's your North, your South, your West, and then that leaves, of course, the General Andrew Jackson, who kind of is from the West. He's originally born in the Carolinas, and then he's really made it as a young man. He's really from Tennessee, and that's where he'll be nominated from. Tennessee was kind of his home state. But General Jackson will have the widest appeal of any of the candidates kind of across all the regions. Because remember, he is a famed war hero from his victory at the Battle of New Orleans. Now, of course, some people did not think that that qualified Jackson to be the highest magistrate, as Henry Clay said. Clay said something like, killing 2,500 Englishmen doesn't, how does killing 2,500 Englishmen qualify someone to be the president? Clay was not a big fan of Jackson. And neither was John Quincy Adams. And the election will become pretty heated, but wait for it, because the election of 1828, 4 years, is going to be even worse. But really, so we have these sectional candidates. They're all Democratic Republicans. Monroe is, publicly not getting into the fray. Privately, he kind of supported John Quincy Adams because remember, that was his Secretary of State. So he'd already kind of said when he appointed JQA, John Quincy Adams, that was his guy. But he's staying out of it and letting the chips fall where they may. And when the Electoral College meets and they hold the vote, we're going to see the breakdown here. You see JQA get 84 votes, and you see Andrew Jackson get 99. Well, you're thinking, Electoral College, according to Article 2 of the Constitution, is what elects the president. I guess Andrew Jackson gets elected in 1824, right? Not so fast. Okay, yes, you're totally right. The Electoral College is what elects the president. I didn't lie to you when we talked about the Constitution back in Unit 3. However, in the Electoral College, you have to have a majority of the votes, not a plurality. So let me explain what those words mean. A plurality is like when you have more votes than the other people. Like in this race, there are 4 viable candidates. Normally when we have a presidential race, like in 2020, this year that I'm recording this is, by the way, October the 9th, October 10th that I'm recording this. So the presidential election is just a few weeks away. There's typically today, 2 major candidates, the Democratic candidate like Joe Biden and the Republican candidate like Donald Trump. But in 1824, you had 4 Democratic Republican candidates, these 4 nominees basically. And so you can see they each got some of the votes. It's not about who had more than the others. That would make Jackson the president. Instead, it's about who has the majority. And the majority means having over half. Now, delegates to the Electoral College, electors as we call them, the number that is apportioned to the Electoral College is based on the number of representatives in the House of Representatives plus the number of senators plus one. So you have 261 electors at this time up for grabs throughout the country as it stood in 1824. Here's what the country looked like in 1824. So there again is 261 total electors up for grabs. In order to win the presidency in 1824, you needed to have one more than half of that number. So half of 261 plus one is 131. So that's the majority. That's slightly over half of the number of electors available. And you'll notice none of the four candidates, not even Andrew Jackson, has at least 131. Meaning, well, what do you do? If nobody has a majority, where does this election go to be determined? Gotcha, fam. Remember in that crazy election of 1800, like there was a Hamilton song sung about and stuff? It's like, can we get back to politics, please, yo? Yeah. In the election of 1800, a very similar thing happened between Adams and Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson. And remember, the election then, according to the 12th Amendment, which will be written because of the election of 1800, goes to the House of Representatives. Okay, where the top three candidates, the 12th Amendment says that the top three candidates will then be determined by the House of Representatives who among those top three shall be president of the United States. By the way, as far as vice president goes, this was totally messed up, but John C. Calhoun of the South, of South Carolina, he had an interesting neck and face. We'll talk more about John C. Calhoun of the South. He had placed his vice presidential aspirational hopes. He'd hitched his wagon to two of the candidates. So he was, get this, the vice presidential candidate to both John Quincy Adams and to Andrew Jackson. And so he wasn't worried. He was like, well, one of these two guys is going to become president. I'm going to be the VP. And he made sure that he was the VP pick for both of them. So John C. Calhoun's got him made in the shape. But anyway, so according to the 12th Amendment now, because of the election of 1800, we had a similar situation. In 1824, the election is going to have to come down to the House of Representatives. Okay. And you can see who got the votes. That basically it splits along these sectional regional lines from where these candidates are from. John Quincy Adams, he carries New England overwhelmingly. William H. Crawford had actually suffered a stroke, so all his machinations didn't really matter. The guy has a stroke. He's not really able to campaign, so he doesn't do as well as he probably was hoping to do, but he still carries a little bit of the vote in the South, especially in the big state of Virginia and in his home state of Georgia. And then Henry Clay carries the West. Of course, he carries Kentucky and then some of the neighboring states there, the new state of Missouri right there. That's the big Mo. And then in the green, you have Andrew Jackson with the widest appeal of any of the candidates, who has the plurality in not only the popular vote, the number of people's votes at this time, but also in the Electoral College. He has the most. That's the plurality. But nobody has the majority. So it's got to go to the House of Representatives, the top three candidates, which would be John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, and William H. Crawford. Henry Clay gets kicked out. I want to just mention also one more thing about the popular vote at this time that's going to be really important 4 years later. A lot of your average American folk at this time were not able to vote. Voting requirements and qualifications go state by state. And at this time in 1824, you had to be white in order to vote in pretty much every American state. You also had to be a man in order to vote. Women really couldn't vote at this time in most American states. And you had to be, remember when this country started, landowning and Protestant and at least 21 years of age. Well, what we're going to see in the election of 1824 is an outcry from the populace, especially from those people who weren't as rich, who maybe didn't own land, and who say it's not fair that you had to be a rich person in order to have a say and vote in this nation. And their cries will be heard by their popular candidate, Andrew Jackson. The common people, they want Jackson. And so in 1828, we're going to see the rise of that democracy. Remember, democracy, demos, means of the people having a say, the common folk, not the rich. And that's why sometimes we talk about this time period, the age of Jackson, as the age of rising democracy in America. And it's not that like suddenly blacks and women and everybody could vote, but we're going to start to see more of the common people being able to have a role in politics. And this is also reaction to the Depression of 1819. Remember, they blamed the banks and the Eastern financial establishment, those rich folk out in the East, for what was happening. The common folk, they wanted a president and a government who would have their interest in mind and who would tear down those things that they saw as hurting them, such as the National Bank. Again, that's what Jackson will do. But anyway, so this election comes down to the House of Representatives. Okay, no majority. We already talked about all that. Well, it just so happens that the one guy that didn't make the top three cuts, Henry Clay from Kentucky, he was the Speaker of the House. Remember that during the Missouri Compromise when he helped, broker that deal? And Henry Clay, he runs the House. Like, he's not just Speaker of the House, he's a very, very powerful Speaker of the House, very influential. And so Henry Clay is going to work it. He's going to make sure he whips and rallies those votes in the House of Representatives, and he's going to get the required majority needed to elect his chosen person. He's kind of the deal breaker, a lot like how Hamilton was in that election of 1800. Remember, Hamilton chose Jefferson over Aaron Burr, because for Hamilton, it was like, well, who do I hate less? I guess I hate Jefferson less because at least he's true to his ideals, unlike Aaron Burr, who stands for nothing, right? So Hamilton played kingmaker in that election in 1800. Henry Clay is going to take that role here in 1824. And here's where it gets a little bit messed up and why this election of 1824 is infamous, and it's infamously remembered as the corrupt bargain. Why did Henry Clay put his support behind JQA? Why does Clay support Adams? He doesn't especially like Adams. They don't really have a big history together. And the reason why he supports Adams was because, well, Henry Clay hated Jackson and he hated Crawford. Crawford's also a vegetable at this point. Don't forget he had that stroke. Henry Clay really hates Jackson, and Henry Clay and Adams both kind of were along the same lines. Adams supported a lot of Clay's American system with the internal improvements, the National Bank, the tariffs. Those were all things that John Quincy Adams was probably in favor of. So he made the natural candidate for Clay to support. And then the messed up part, rumors began to circulate that there was a backroom deal between John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay, where Henry Clay propositioned Adams, basically asking Adams, hey, if I put my support behind you and I get my House of Representatives to make you the president of the United States and decide this election, will you make me your Secretary of State? Did it happen? I don't know. John Quincy Adams, like his father before him, like John Adams, was an incredibly principled man. Like John Quincy Adams, he's not known for doing shady stuff. And in fact, everything he did had an outward appearance of being completely above board. Like JQA is incredibly principled. Remember his father, like standing up for those British soldiers, the Boston Massacre, even though everybody was demanding their blood. He's like, no, guys, let justice prevail. Let the truth and facts prevail. Facts are fickle things, John Adams said. This is his son that he raised and groomed for the presidency. So it seems very far-fetched to believe that John Quincy Adams would cut such a corrupt deal, such a corrupt bargain with Henry Clay. But remember, that Secretary of State position is incredibly important. Being named as the President's Secretary of State was like getting the thumbs up for being the next president of the United States. So, and it's possible maybe there was a deal. But anyway, regardless of if it happened or not, Jackson supporters are going to believe that it did. And Jackson is going to make the next 4 years all about retaking the White House because he feels like the selection of 1824 was completely stolen from him. Because, well, the House votes and they needed a majority. They needed 13 members of the House to basically vote for John Quincy Adams, and he gets exactly 13. And so he wins on the first ballot. John Quincy Adams becomes the president of the United States, and he's going to name immediately as his Secretary of State Henry Clay. And so Jackson and his supporters, they call bloody foul. They will make the next 4 years of John Quincy Adams' presidency a living hell for him, and come back for revenge in 1828. One last thing, Martin Van Buren, the little fox of Kinderhook, he was a New York congressman, I think the New York senator actually, and he was a big William Crawford fan, and actually was one of Crawford's main campaign managers. So when Crawford had a stroke, it kind of messed up Martin Van Buren's political maneuverings. And Martin Van Buren, with the crazy hair here, crazy lack of hair, um, he is a really, really amazing political mind. Like he knew how to manipulate like nobody's business. So Martin Van Buren, he's going to jump ship here and start working for Andrew Jackson. And that's going to be really important because Martin Van Buren, he's going to help make Jackson's dreams a reality in 1828 and get Jackson elected. And then 8 years of Jackson later, the next president of the United States, guess who Jackson had chosen to be his Secretary of State? That's right, Martin Van Buren. That's how he becomes president for 4 years. So we call this the corrupt bargain. And again, just please in your notes, make sure that you write down what this was about. That basically the election of 1824, because there's no majority in the Electoral College, comes down to a tie. Even though Jackson had a plurality in both the popular and electoral votes. And because there was no majority, it goes to the House of Representatives. Henry Clay, being the fourth candidate, is no longer in competition, but he is the kingmaker. As the Speaker of House, he's going to push the congressman in the House to support John Quincy Adams for president. And John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay may or may not have made a secret deal, a corrupt bargain for Henry Clay to make JQA the president, and in return, JQA would make Henry Clay his Secretary of State, basically naming him as the future next president. That is the corrupt bargain, and Jackson is going to be livid. All right, we will end there. Thank you guys so much. I'll talk to you later. Bye.